You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. With the help of a wide range of guests, we examine how war and peace are experienced in different periods and places, and we discuss the world-building impact which representations of conflict and its aftermath can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice König, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. My guest today is Professor Marsha Henry, the Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair in Women, Peace, Security and Justice at the Mitchell Institute at Queen's University, Belfast. Over the course of an impressive career, Marsha's research has focused particularly on the complex relationships between gender, militarisation and peacekeeping. As well as writing a wealth of articles and chapters on these topics, she spent time over the past 20 years documenting the social experiences of people living and working in peacekeeping missions. And her book on this ethnographic-inspired research, The End of Peacekeeping, Gender, Race and the Martial Politics of Intervention, was published in March 2024 by University of Pennsylvania Press. Marsha, I'm really grateful to you for making time to discuss your new book and your wider research. It's really interesting material to get our teeth into. But first, let me welcome you to the Visualising War and Peace podcast.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this.
So we're going to come to peacekeeping, or the end of it, in a bit, but I wonder if we can start by digging into militarisation a little bit. Can you kick us off by giving our listeners a quick definition of militarisation and maybe some examples of everyday militarisms that we might encounter in the course of an average day?
So I guess how I approach militarization in my everyday work and in the book is that I start from very much the inspiration from Enlow's idea of militarization as something that we can find and relate to from everyday practices. And really, militarization can be very much defined by the concept of process. So it's something very active. It's about how we value things that are martial in the everyday and how we give them a value that is much higher than things that are seen as related to the civilian, to the everyday person that's outside of the institution of the military. So she has a very specific definition, which a lot of people quote in their work, which is the ways in which military ideals and values are driven deep down into the soil of society, right? But actually what I do in the book is to take the concept of militarization as different from militarism. Militarism is more focused on ideology, and militarization was also supposed to move us as a scholarly community away from just the military institution as the site in which people can become militarized. So we can look at gangs or militias or paramilitaries and see them as undergoing processes of militarization. But what I do is I take militarization and I put it alongside the concept of martial politics, which Ali Howell has produced in her work. And so what martial politics does is I think it puts a check on the idea that militarization is something that emerges only in parallel to something that is called civil society. So what Howell does is Howell says, but actually, if you look at a lot of, for example, post-colonial societies, you'll see that actually the martial was the foundation of that colonial founding, and that there was no time when there wasn't this martial power. So I take both of those concepts, militarization as inspired by Enlow, martial politics as inspired by Howell, and then I put them together. And I guess a practical example that I found in the peacekeeping was very much the ways in which people, for example, took pride in their military uniforms, and they invested in that as a kind of identity. But at the same time, they shared their dissatisfaction with belonging to those institutions or the kinds of effects that those institutions had on wider society. So they wore a martial uniform, but they were claiming to be the people bringing peace, for example. And those kinds of contradictions, I think, reflect those two different definitions of militarization and martial politics.
Thank you. So one of the things that you've helped us grapple with there is the way in which we can't disaggregate military institutions, military phenomena, and civilian society. We find all sorts of martial ideas, martial ideologies, militarisms, militarization within civilian society, even in context of peace building, of course. As you note, Cynthia Enloe famously has talked about it being driven deep into the soil, and something that's very, very pervasive in what we see people wearing, pervasive in the UK. We've obviously just had Remembrance Sunday. We're literally watching people in uniform parading on the streets as part of Remembrance. So militarisation is a very important part of that, for example, in lots of different ways. And Cynthia Enloe has underlined the fact that most of the people in the world, and I'm quoting now, most of the people in the world who are militarised are not themselves in uniform. Most militarised people are civilians. And that's really speaking to that point, that militarization runs very deep. Another important truth about militarization, which you have stressed and all sorts of others who work on it, is that it's not simply a top-down one-way process where individuals or civilians get militarized by the state or by powerful institutions, by the military. It's actually, militarization occurs through all sorts of different social and cultural mechanisms. So it occurs through childhood play, for example. It occurs through detective stories, the fact that Sherlock Holmes and his Dr. Watson is a sort of former veteran, for example. There are lots of examples of our favourite detectives who have a veteran past, and that's activated in their identities and their storytelling. It occurs through crime thrillers, commemoration practices, as I just mentioned. And discourses of gender are, of course, one social mechanism where we actually do see processes of militarization at work. And you've looked at this. Can you tell us a little bit more about what feminist approaches to these topics can bring, that's new, that's different from the scholarship that's been done in previous decades, which hasn't been driven by this kind of research?
I think that that's a really important question actually to ask, because the studies of militarization, if we think of a field like critical military studies, which is very much an interdisciplinary field of study and research. And it's also a field of study that is characterized by its foundation in being critical of the institution of the military and the military's effects on people. And if we look at that critical military studies as one example, we can see that there's quite a lot of work that employs feminist methodologies within critical military studies. And you can see in peacekeeping scholarship that there is also quite a bit of feminist work, perhaps not as much or as well developed in some ways. And there's also a lot of work that analyzes gender. So I think militarization is very much a contested sort of, there's a real scramble to kind of define it even more critically than it already has been defined. But in peacekeeping, I think there's less of an urgency to be critical of concepts of gender. I think sometimes I have witnessed gender being treated very much like a variable rather than a complex sort of site of contested identities or processes. So what I've tried to do in the book in particular, but I bring it, to most of my work, is to employ an intersectional feminist lens or an intersectional feminist sensitivity. And what that does is it doesn't require me to use intersectionality in a strict way, impose it as a framework, although there's not anything wrong with doing that. I just use intersectionality to remind me to pay attention to multiple axes of oppression and identity. So I'm always asking the question, well, okay, so where do these peacekeepers come from? What is their position in their home societies? What is their position when they're posted to a peacekeeping mission? So I'm interested in the politics of location and the politics of identity as they fit into systems and structures. So intersectional sensitivities allow me to do that. And I think the other thing that I would just add on that intersectional note is that intersectionality is very much a concept that inherits ideas from Black feminist theory. So I don't see intersectional feminist theory as something that can be set aside or extracted outside of Black feminist theory.
Okay, and that brings me actually on to another question. So you've brought up intersectionality and the lens or the sensitivity that intersectional feminist approaches can help you bring, where you are paying attention to multiple sites of identity as you analyze both militarization and peacekeeping. And your research has pointed to multiple problems, but it's not simply the case that militarization operates along axes of gender, and I'm quoting you here, but we also tend to default to white reference points and white authority and white expertise, even when we're actually advocating for more inclusive thinking, more inclusive practice when we're thinking about militarization and when we're thinking about peacekeeping. So can you say a little bit more about how you think race and gender actually intersect in how we visualize both war and peacekeeping?
Yeah, so I think I was very much inspired to write about intersectionality before the book, like to bring intersectionality into discussions of militarization and peacekeeping, because I was really struck by what I saw as an increasing use of intersectionality in different either women, peace, and security contexts or studies of military institutions or military and soldiers, for example. And I saw that intersectionality was sometimes being invoked, and I felt like it was being invoked to reflect multiple differences, perhaps in identity, but in identity alone. So it was not drawing attention to the systems of power that were at work or the structures of oppression that are at work. So, for example, there were a couple of articles and presentations that I came across that were looking at invoking intersectionality to talk about men's experiences of being minorities in military institutions. And I found that really curious. I found that strange that this concept of intersectionality was being adopted into contexts where the racial politics or the racial hierarchies were not equally being studied. I called it a flattening of intersectionality as from its radical potential, right? It just flattened the idea of intersectionality. And so I really thought that that was a kind of attempt to recenter these sort of white reference points that I talk about and this white authority, because it was actually appropriating Black feminist concepts and theories, but not talking about Blackness, not talking about Black women, not talking about the marginality of different groups of individuals, or only talking about marginality in a very politically, I think, questionable way.
Really interesting. So these different approaches emerge, which offer opportunities to explore systems of oppression, structures of power, but then can be harnessed in all sorts of ways, which actually in some shape or form can reinforce some of those systems of oppression and structures of power that without intending to, because of the scholarly habits that we have, the habits of thought, habits of asking questions that we have. So it's interesting to see how even within critical military studies, critical analysis of militarization, some of the critical elements of that can get diffused. And as you say, that nice metaphor of flattening the intersectionality rather than keeping attention on these different dimensions. Your professorial chair, the name of your professorial chair, clearly references the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which advocated for much more attention to women's experiences and inclusion in peace and security efforts. Now, for listeners who aren't familiar with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, could you tell us a little bit more about it and perhaps reflect on how successfully or not it has tended to be implemented to date?
Thank you for that question, because I guess if you'd asked me this question a few years ago, I probably would have been somewhat more negative about the success of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. That's really an agenda. I'm not sure that anyone can identify the agenda in a simple, straightforward way now, because the architecture that is this UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which was specifically a resolution to address issues of gender inequality and to address issues of rights. So it's very much based on on security studies and conflict studies, and it's very much based on human rights kind of discussions. And the whole idea was to sort of put women onto the map, so to speak, and to get experiences that might have been previously dismissed as, soft issues or issues to do with matters of the domestic sphere or the private sphere, the attempt by various feminist advocates, both in the civil society sector and in global governance positions, was to put women onto the visual agenda, so to speak. But of course, there were the same kinds of problems that one saw in the previous decades of women and development, or women in development as it started, and then it became gender and development. And you see, I think, some similar developments between this official agenda, the Women, Peace, Security agenda, which named women as a category and as a political group that is often marginalized and that needs specific addressing, and the corresponding scholarship, research, positions, chairs, that is gender, peace, and security. And so I think a lot of people have moved away from women, peace, and security because they haven't liked the very singular nature of women in the title. And then there's also very much a critique of the gender, peace, and security scholarship, which is that civil society organizations or even government officials have said that scholarship in a way has become so abstract or so removed from the everyday experiences of women in conflict zones, for example. But again, I would say now, you're asking me this question right now, I feel like there is a very well-developed dialogue between the two. I think, and others have started to argue this in various ways, but I think part of the problem is that this dialogue is still very much not as intersectional as I would want it to be. So that's how I would say, I think those two, I think there are critical voices within each sector that I've just sort of created as these two bifurcated fields. But I think there's still problems in communicating. I think these colonial critiques, for example, or these intersectional critiques, and then the actual policies, programs associated with the agenda.
So multiple gaps, so a certain amount of progress, right? Critical thinking has developed both around women, peace and security, and gender, peace and security, and women and gender and marginalized experiences are more on the map, to the extent that actually marginalized groups are more understood and engaged with as political subjects and agents. This is progress, but there are still gaps. There's still some gaps between the theory and the practice, and also this lack of attention to the intersectionality of it all. And in a sense, that's where your work really sits. It's actually trying to address some of these gaps. So in our conversation so far, we've dug into militarisation a little bit, the innate high value of the military in many, many societies that's invisible to us in some ways in the everyday, but is there, really pervasive. And that intersects also with the male privilege. It intersects with white privilege. So these different axes of privilege and high value, which of course have a low value end to them as well, which are the people who are lower valued. And we've looked at that in terms of militarisation, but it'd be really great now actually to dig specifically into peacekeeping. And obviously your book is very much about the end of peacekeeping. You've got an abolitionist view, an argument which we'll come to in a minute. One of the things I think that brought you to thinking about the end of peacekeeping was looking at some of the harms which peacekeeping and peacekeepers have done to women among other people. So, for example, sexual exploitation of local women by peacekeeping forces is a well-known problem amongst peace practitioners, but it often surprises and horrifies many people in the wider public who have a more sanitized impression of peacekeeping missions. Can you just tell us a bit more about how widespread that particular problem is, and also what the problem of sexual exploitation of local women by peacekeepers tells us about wider problems endemic to peacekeeping as a process as it's currently done?
Yeah, so one of the things that struck me when I first started to do this research on peacekeeping, it actually started with studying sexual exploitation and abuse, and then it went into a lot of different directions, but I kind of kept coming back to that. And I guess it started with the previous book that I wrote with my colleague. The book was concerned with trying to understand relations between local women and predominantly male peacekeepers. That's how it sort of simply started. But then we found that the context in which we were doing the research had already become quite charged with more and more cases of sexual exploitation being shared in the media and exposed by various civil society organizations, women's organizations, or human rights organizations. I became really interested in how can we understand both the extent of sexual exploitation of local women by peacekeeping forces. What is the current stats, as you have, implied by your question? And then how do we understand it? And I guess because the book is really about how we understand peacekeeping, I became quite critical anything that would be a fact about sexual exploitation, because I think we need to think about the sort of what peacekeeping purports to mean, what it sells itself as, and then all the assumptions. So you say the sanitized impression of peacekeeping missions, and I would love for someone to do a study, a widespread study of people's perceptions of peacekeeping all around the world, like a kind of global map of how people feel peacekeeping missions are good or need to be continued. I think there's some work actually being done in Denmark. There was a big project, a Danish government funded project to look at Ghanaian peacekeeping. And I think a large aspect of that project's research findings call into question whether people feel confident in the peacekeepers and their return and what kind of work they're doing and whether tax money justifies it. So I guess I'm really interested in the representation of sexual exploitation and abuse by different scholars and by policymakers and practitioners. So I will just say that the UN's way of addressing sexual exploitation paints a very particular picture. It has a very particular gendered understanding, and it makes that explicit. But what it doesn't make explicit is who the peacekeepers are, what they're doing there in the first place. And then once you actually look into that, I think you'd have a more critical approach to sexual exploitation and abuse. So I think early reports on sexual exploitation and abuse that we found in the early 2000s, those very much exposed the kind of sex for food exchanges that involved mostly military peacekeepers. And if you look at the sort of, most recent scholarly work on sexual exploitation and abuse, a book by Jasmine Westendorf that is, I think, a fantastic overview of all the aspects of sexual exploitation and abuse, both, from the micro politics of transactional sex to the colonial hangovers that are present in peacekeeping missions.
Okay, thank you. It would be really fascinating to have a map of how different people in different contexts, geographical, but also context near and far from armed conflict themselves, view peacekeeping missions, peacekeepers. You've asked the question what peacekeeping sells itself as, what it purports to do, and who are the peacekeepers. Do we need to dig a bit more into who are the peacekeepers at this point? I think that would be a really helpful thing for you to put a bit of flesh on the bones of, just so that we can think beyond perhaps the UN blue helmets as the people who have, maybe come first into the mind. Who else might we put into that category of who are the peacekeepers?
Yes, actually, one of the things that I would have liked to have explored more in the book is two aspects of who are the peacekeepers. And I think I touch on both these aspects, but I wish I'd gone into more detail. So one of the questions is, who are the peacekeepers? Like, who are they literally? Where do they come from? And you can find that on the UN websites. You can find that in a couple of key texts on peacekeeping. You can find the composition of peacekeepers. And, the conclusion mostly has been that the majority of peacekeepers are coming from global South militaries, if we're talking about military peacekeepers. And I don't have to hand appropriate statistics on where civilian peacekeepers come from, but police and military peacekeepers have been historically coming predominantly from the global South, and at least in the last 20 years. So in that sense, that gives a very sharp kind of indication of who the boots on the ground are, as it's generally referred to. But I guess I also wanted to ask the question, who are the peacekeepers, in a sort of more philosophical epistemological sense, a sort of greater thinking behind it. Like, who are they? How do they think of themselves? Do they think of themselves as humanitarians, as benevolent? There's a whole group of scholars working on humanitarian identities and how people who work in Médecins Sans Frontières and Red Cross, how they see themselves. So there is work out there. But I guess I wanted to look at that a little bit more, but I didn't explore that in the book. But I think like what I do is I critique in the book the peacekeeping as an organization or as an institution and what it purports in terms of official UN discourses. So I can't really hold accountable individual peacekeepers for that overall discourse and narrative. I guess that's why I was reluctant to really explore with peacekeepers. Like, what do you think you're doing here? Do you think you're doing a good job? Do you think you're bringing peace? I felt like in a way that would be quite arrogant to expect, someone who's come over for an administrative job of peacekeeping to suddenly then have to espouse a really ethical humanitarian identity. Thank you for bringing that up because it's something that I think I wanted to explore a bit more and didn't get a chance to. But I think maybe one last thing to say is if you follow the kind of information that you would find on the UN Twitter site, it would often reinforce that idea of the UN as a kind of noble institution, as an institution doing good. Obviously, they're not going to put on their Twitter site like, hey, another case of sexual exploitation and abuse has knocked our reputation. But, I think that they often engaged in discourses that elevated the institution or the organization in lofty terms, in terms that were salvational, that were based on rescue or duty or honor. They didn't really fight that discourse, which perhaps is unrealistic to expect them to, but I think they really relished in that discourse of an older time, actually, and of a very colonial time, if you dig really deep into some of those narratives.
Really fascinating. And narratives, as you know, is what the Visualising War and Peace project is really fundamentally interested in. I think you've pointed to a really fascinating area of study, which is this tension perhaps, or the complex relationship between the macro narratives that the UN tells on Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days, or whatever social media platform they're using, these salvation narratives, and then these much more personal and interpersonal narratives that might be part of someone's career identity, self-identity as one of the boots on the ground or a civilian peacekeeper. It sort of takes me back actually to a point you made earlier about a manifestation of militarisation is feeling maybe a pride in the uniform while actually being maybe critical of some of the activities of the military institution that one belongs to. These two things can sit together and sit in tension. But that does bring me actually really to a core feature of your book, The End of Peacekeeping. You make a really compelling point in your opening chapter that ties very closely into our research interest at the Visualising War and Peace Project's interest in the feedback loop between narrative and reality. So you explain that the more research you did on peacekeeping, the more you realised it was, and I'm quoting now, an epistemic project that actively produces knowledge about peacekeeping peoples and practices, and in doing so maintains global systems of power and inequality, including heterosexism, colonialism, racism and militarism. So what you're saying there is that peacekeeping isn't just an activity, a process on the ground, it's a knowledge project, it's a knowledge producing project that's producing knowledge that's then maintaining, you've already referenced, maintaining these older ideas, these salvation narratives perhaps. So can you give us a couple of concrete examples of this, really to help us grapple with what you're arguing here and just help us understand how exactly peacekeeping produces knowledge and what the ramifications of that are?
Yeah, so I think I have, many examples in the book, but I was just thinking of one that I write about in the book and I explain, but that really struck me. And that was, when I was at an oversight meeting that the police command was giving to journalists. Myself and another colleague were, just sitting in and observing how the UN represents itself in journalistic, to a journalistic audience and represents its policing activities. And of course, because there was this hope to develop this oversight, this civilian oversight of policing as a way of democratizing the post-conflict setting. It was really fascinating. And so during the break in this meeting, I was standing outside, and you inevitably stand outside with the smokers, but you get a lot of really interesting ethnographic insights when you stand and talk to smokers. And so he was a civilian from a humanitarian organization, so not a peacekeeper himself. And he just unwrapped the plastic wrapper on the outside of his packet of cigarettes and then just threw it into the garden of this building. It's a police building, really. It's a security space. But there are these relatively well-kept gardens in between the buildings. And he just threw it. And I guess he saw me disapprovingly look at it. He implied that this place is a mess or this place is a hole, and such that really makes no difference. The impact of the humanitarian individual or the humanitarian, it's like a drop in the ocean, which was. And so I felt that very much any criticism that would come to peacekeeping as an institution often, was countered with this kind of disdain or dismissing of local spaces, local people, everything that people were, their everyday lives were then just kind of discounted into a narrative of, well, this place is in decay anyway, or this peacekeeping mission is not working, and so it's not my fault, kind of thing. So I think that was one example. There was another example, I think, as well, where peacekeepers would, and I think I talk about this right after that example, just driving in a car in a UN vehicle. And there's so many restrictions and expectations on UN peacekeepers when they're in their vehicles. I mean, there's expectations about them keeping the windows up, keeping their seatbelts on, keeping to speed limit. But they transgress so many of those, so peacekeepers would roll down the windows and throw out litter, very similar to that example. And they would say the same sort of things, that this place was already messed up. So this little piece of debris, the UN didn't sanction this behavior. But somehow I feel that by creating this idea of this humanitarian space and these local people in need of rescue, and this is what your task is, this is what your work is, it either maintained the colonial knowledge that you can find in other development projects and other humanitarian projects, the developmental knowledge that actually the society was developmentally delayed and so didn't deserve the kind of treatment and didn't deserve the kind of narratives, really. So I think it was contributing to this idea of this place both as a site of chaos and a site of disorganization and despair and disintegration. And at the same time, people also talked about these spaces as blank slates. There was also this very neoliberal discourse of the promise of these places. If only people picked up the litter themselves, if only people went to this self-defense class that peacekeepers were putting on, if only they had the knowledge that we have, and this is very much white knowledge of Europe. If only they had that, their lives would be so much better. So I guess that's why I was really drawn to the idea of framing this as epistemology, because it seemed like that they were actually contributing to both the system of understanding in peacekeeping missions, but also this was filtering very much into the scholarship. So the academic scholarship was also then either contesting this knowledge in some ways or reinforcing this knowledge through other means.
And I think it's something that you talk about in the book as global north thinking that relies on global south labour, as you've already indicated. Then these really embedded mentalities, as you say, of the blank slate, this place that could be a place of progress, or this place that's a place of chaos and is almost unrescuable because whatever efforts the peacekeeping mission can offer or the humanitarian mission can offer is a drop in the ocean. All of that actually reinforcing a status quo rather than being change making. And so I think one of the great features of the book is the way in which you really put your finger on what it is that actually gets in the way of this progress. And it's not for want of resources. It's not for want of necessarily action on the ground. It's this global north thinking. the knowledge that is not only produced but reinforced, perpetuated, maintained all the way through, that is a real barrier. You mentioned just now sort of dismissal of local spaces, dismissal of local lives, and you ask this very, very important question in the book. You talk about wanting to pay attention to the peace kept, and the phrase, that reinforces the sort of power differential between the peacekeepers and the peace kept. And you ask in the book, which lives matter in peacekeeping? And then in your discussion of this, you do explore various ways in which peacekeeping perpetuates both racist and colonialist relations of power. Can you say a little bit more about that? What are the consequences for the people who you talk about as the peace kept of this perpetuation of racist and colonializing ways of thinking, habits of thought, relations of power?
Yes, in fact, I'll talk about the peace kept briefly, and then I'll talk about an example of how eclipsing of the peace kept continues even in contemporary politics around peacekeeping. So I think I don't do justice to the peace kept in the book. It's a shortcoming, but it's almost a purposeful shortcoming, because I kept saying that all this scholarship that I critique in the first part of the book doesn't pay enough attention to the peace kept. And then in a way, I don't pay enough attention to the peace kept in the book itself. I guess what I wanted to do was really expose the way in which the peace kept get constructed epistemically, so to speak. And I keep using that term, and it's a very uncomfortable term, and other people have asked me, what do people who are locals think about the term the peace kept when you use it? And I think that actually exposed a lot of my presentations of my book so far have not been to the people that would be considered the peace kept. They've been to my global north audiences and to the scholars, that perhaps already are engaged in critical work around peacekeeping. But I guess I used the peace kept because I wanted to highlight that power differential, and I wanted to highlight the objectification of those individuals. And so, like the article that you were referring to, where I talk about women, peace, and security, and I think that there is a subject of the women, peace, and security agenda that is not too dissimilar from the peace kept. They're referent objects often in the scholarship and in the policy and the practice. They become just like these figures, these almost like phantom figures in documents and in discourses, and they don't end up having agency, or if they do have agency, it's really to usurp the benefits of peacekeepings, the intentions of the UN, for example. I could have done much more. And I think that's potentially the next project, is to look at, okay, what would it mean to focus on the peace kept? And I don't think I could do that in a way that would be pure, because I think that's the whole point of my critique, that there is no noble, benign peace kept either. They're also products of this epistemic project. So yeah, and then I guess to link it to the contemporary examples, some of the press statements that were made when UN peacekeepers were under attack in Lebanon, in UNIFIL, was really fascinating to me. Again, there was sort of moral outrage, as there should be for these attacks. But the moral outrage was more that the peacekeepers were targeted. And I think there was this idea like, okay, so now maybe we'll take some of this militarized violence seriously, because now peacekeepers are being targeted. And then there was a really interesting reaction, because some of the peacekeepers that were targeted were named as Irish peacekeepers. And so the Irish government was rightly concerned about its military personnel being under attack. But again, when I dug through some of the media reports, I couldn't find which peacekeepers had been attacked. And I thought it was really interesting that there was this focus on this group of amorphous peacekeepers. We didn't know where they were from. And then we also didn't hear who had been killed amongst the peace kept, or who had been injured, who had been displaced as a result of this military action. So in a way, peacekeeping continues to eclipse the violence and inequality and the harms that are perpetuated on other adjacent groups of people who are living in those contexts, who are not expats or foreign workers, really. And so, yeah, so I think it's really important to keep going back to this peace kept that hopefully my book inspires people to do.
And, in a sense, I suppose what we could see in that response to the attacks on peacekeepers in Lebanon is a manifestation of militarisation, in a sense, which is that the lives we value the most are the ones in uniform, the ones we attribute a high ideals to, a moral high ground up to a point. And I think what you are pointing out really well is that we have particular expectations. We obviously have expectations of what peacekeepers are like, which don't match up to reality, as we've already explored. But we also have expectations of what the peace kept should be like. And I'm reminded a little bit of adjacent research on, for example, the imagined child, which is something that we've talked about on the podcast before with scholars like Marsha and Helen Berendt. It's an idea that's explored in all sorts of scholarship, the idea that when we talk about children in conflict zones, we're actually talking about an imagined child and an imagined kind of childhood, an idealized one. But I'm also reminded of some of the conversations that we've had about imagined refugees as well, and the gratitude that's expected, the ongoing gratitude that's expected of refugees. All of that being a way to keep refugees who have been accepted into a community still in some kind of subordinate, less agential role. And maybe that's one of the things that's going on with the knowledge that's being produced around the peace kept and some of the expectations of what they ought to look like, sound like, behave like, and struggle to wrestle with the much grittier, much more complex, nuanced reality of all sorts of different people coming in and out of that category at different points in their lives.
Yeah, if I can just respond to that, because that is actually such an important point, and it's bringing me back to why I turned to the sort of post-colonial or critical race studies literature. And it was very much inspired when I read, and I talk about her book quite a bit in my book, Shireen Razak's book, Dark Threats, White Knights. And in that, which is very much a book about the colonial violence of peacekeepers, it very much involves a child who is actually assaulted and murdered by peacekeepers, the ways in which the narratives trying to justify these actions move from viewing that individual as a child and then trying to move them towards an adult or sort of a threatening potential soldier. And again, you see that so much in contemporary politics as well, this idea of unchilding, that others have spoken about. I'm sure Helen and Marshall have talked about that. So I think that that's a really important point, because I think the colonial critiques give us additional frameworks, additional concepts with which to look at what happens to the peace kept. Are they infantilized? Are they orientalized? Are they made to be this kind of cunning natives who manipulate and aren't grateful for the kinds of things that are being given to them? Going back to the sexual exploitation and abuse, are they always and already victims of the humanitarian setting, in which case they need a certain type of protection that only peacekeepers can give? There's titles of articles relating, like, who's protecting the protectors, or who's watching the protectors, who's checking in on them. And the literature on children is, I think, a great way to extend the arguments that are in the book more broadly.
And you argue strongly throughout the book that the problems that you've identified with peacekeeping culture and peacekeeping practice are so ingrained and so harmful that we need a full-scale abolition of peacekeeping as we know it. Now, for lots of people, this is going to seem like a really controversial proposal. So how would you convince skeptics that abolition is in fact the best solution? And are there any alternative options?
I guess, I've been asked a similar question so many times. And so it's good. And I guess I keep holding on to it. And maybe that's why it took me 20 years to make that argument, but also why I make it so briefly. I think I make it throughout the book in different ways, but I sort of address it directly, very briefly at the end. And it's because I guess I myself am holding on to what I consider to be more effective things that peacekeeping offers. It makes us feel like it's a solution or a response that we can't get rid of. There's something really compelling about that. I think if I got together with other peacekeeping scholars, and if it was a closed conversation, I think we'd all agree that peacekeeping could easily be abolished, but we'd also agree we ourselves can't let go of it as a scholastic subject, but also there's some kind of like deep emotional psychic attachments that we have. So it took me quite a while to get to the position, but I guess when I concluded each of the three sort of sections on race, on gender, and on the martial, if I'm just putting those in simplistic terms, I think when I thought about, what does peacekeeping have to say about, what do we know about peacekeeping and gender? What do we know about peacekeeping and race? What do we know about peacekeeping and the military? I concluded that for each of those, it wasn't looking good. The foundational thinking, the practices were just so problematic. There were so many examples of harms being produced, epistemic harms and on the ground harms, like material harms, that in the end I thought, well, really, if we keep going back to this idea that we have to like fix it, and if I think about the work of Aiko Holvikivi, her recent book, Fixing Gender, which I think is a fantastic title and piece of work, what does it mean to try and tinker with and try and solve the problem of peacekeeping? And then also, what does it mean when we fix peacekeeping into a particular place, like we see it as necessary? So, I'm inspired by her paradox of fixing, very much so in terms of, so I reached the conclusion that really one has to do away with peacekeeping as we know it, because it doesn't serve us to use Marie Kondo's idea of like, if something in your closet doesn't work, doesn't serve you, get rid of it. So maybe we do a Marie Kondo on peacekeeping and we say like, okay, let's look at gender, let's look at race, let's look at military. And are there good things that come out of these? Foundationally, no, because if we pay attention to the epistemology of it, it's not good. It's tying us, it's anchoring us in these problematic binaries or these problematic ways of thinking. So, just to go back to the question of who are the peacekeepers, which I think relates to this abolitionist conclusion, I didn't mention, of course, that there are also a lot of women peacekeepers, and there's been, I say a lot, it's not a lot, and that's part of the problem. So there's been books on peacekeepers, articles. I've written an article on women peacekeepers. I talk about them in the book, but really peacekeeping is this extremely male-dominated project, and the reluctance of the UN to address the problems that stem from that proved to me at least one of the concepts that I introduce in terms of gender that proves that peacekeeping can't continue in its current form. So then, but then we could look at the colonial, and then we could look at the martial. Again, there's so many problems attached to that. I think the problems with peacekeeping are perhaps not worth fixing. They're not worth reforming, because when we look at the foundations of them, they're based on these violent foundations.
I know you're reluctant to simplify, but it does do a really useful job of disaggregating for all that you then want to put them back together, gender, the martial, and race, and showing in those three separate ways how embedded peacekeeping is in habits of thinking about and talking about and operating within gender and the martial that perpetuate all sorts of inequalities. So you said that peacekeeping doesn't serve us, right? But it does clearly serve some people. So I was asking a really cynical question, who does it serve, right? Who does peacekeeping serve? Just to kind of get all cynical about this for a few minutes.
Yeah, maybe just to go back to why I turned to the abolitionist kind of ending point. And I guess I'd seen a couple of things. Like I talked to individuals who were like, yeah, I'm writing about defunding the police, for example, or defunding the military in various contexts. And I thought, yeah, why aren't these discussions about abolition trickling into any of the peacekeeping scholarship? And it's just like intersectionality, which again doesn't feature very significantly. It features in development studies, which is a related field. It features in humanitarian studies. So I feel like peacekeeping scholarship has just really not taken on some of this critical literature in the ways one would expect, considering its sort of interdisciplinary roots and its connection with colonial pasts and its and its male dominated and martial features. So yeah, I guess I was thinking about abolition as an obvious starting point and an obvious ending point. And you had asked, is there an alternative? And again, as I said, I've been asked that question so many times. So I guess I figured that I wasn't in the best place, given all the critical things that I've said. I wasn't best placed to actually imagine a future of peacekeeping. And I think that there's lots of people that are, both scholars and practitioners. And I know people are working on like non-military peacekeeping programs, policies, ideas. I know that there's also a whole wing of peacekeeping scholars who sort of say, well, Marsha, it's interesting that you write this book at this moment and advocate for abolition because peacekeeping as we know it kind of is disintegrating anyway, no longer exists. And I guess it's like kind of bad timing that I'm like, yeah, we should get rid of peacekeeping because, it's kind of almost coming to an organic and natural death. I was hoping that the book would be about getting us to be aware of the epistemology or the epistemic project that is peacekeeping, and that maybe people could dwell in different imaginaries. And so really bring the peace back into peacekeeping. What would it mean to think about peace differently? What would it mean to think about peace alongside the peace kept? And we wouldn't call them the peace kept anymore, right? We would think about not glorifying or romanticizing partnerships with individuals, because we know from the history that is also has its own colonial roots, and that there are ethical problems with that. But yeah, what would it mean to imagine a different landscape, one where militaries are not the center and militarism isn't the overriding ideology? So I guess I wanted to create the space for that. And I have still yet to have a conversation with people sitting around the room thinking about what would it look like to engage in some kind of humanitarian intervention or some humanitarian partnership that, didn't uphold militarism. What would it look like if humanitarian projects actually eschewed militarism? They were against militarism. I was thinking about, Médecins Sans Frontières, for example, and their claims to neutrality, which I think had an anti-militarist basis when they began. Unfortunately, in lots of places, they've had to be in these negotiations with military projects and military entities because of the complex nature of conflict and post-conflict settings. But yeah, I don't want to romanticize some peaceful golden age. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to see what that looks like. I've recently been on a fieldwork trip to Cyprus, and part of that is documenting what do spaces look like? What does the actual visual landscape look like in a post-conflict space that had a peacekeeping mission, still does. It's very administrative and small. It's not particularly martial. But the setting of the UN headquarters in Nicosia has all these legacies of the martial, but it has a very different post-conflict culture. And again, there's lots to be changed in many ways or to be criticized, but there's also these really interesting projects that young people, for example, are engaged in, and artists and architects, creating spaces where people can cross through. There's like a whole botanic project in the space. So I guess there's like lots of futurity that we need scholars to be engaged in developing concepts around. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's probably not me that should be in charge of that, but there's lots of people working in science and technology studies, people who are doing work on the post-human, doing work on the environment and climate change, and political theorists, philosophers. I think we need to be engaging in conversations about peacekeeping that include these individuals working with different conceptual frameworks and ontologies, really.
And this really ties into the argument that you do make in the book for the alternative. The first step of it is abolish peacekeeping as we know it, but you also talk about knowing differently. That's a phrase that you use. And that really ties into everything you've just been saying there. Now, of course, in this moment in time, the idea of giving up on aspirations for peace, work towards peace, is an appalling idea. And at no point are you advocating for an end to peace. You're interested actually in how we can move towards peace building and peace work that is less racist, that is less sexist, that is less martial, that is less colonialist, that is actually more inclusive of different people's experiences and identities, and is breaking down inequalities. You mentioned earlier the sort of almost fondness that at least people who haven't lived in a place where there has been a peacekeeping mission have for the idea of UN peacekeeping, and those narratives around the noble purpose of peacekeeping, they're really powerful. They have real traction. So it is something that's incredibly hard to let go of. But you used a phrase just now, different imaginaries, and that's exactly what really your argument is and what we're talking about. These different imaginaries that bring in different voices. The peace kept, as you say, you've touched on young people. I mean, I suppose up to a point, the women, peace and security agenda, and indeed the youth, peace and security agenda, are attempts to imagine peace differently and imagine peace building and peacekeeping differently, albeit still within frameworks that actually embed some inequalities and some structural and cultural violence, actually, up to a point, but keeping going at these different imaginaries, these different ways of imagining peace, and expanding our peace literacy by bringing these different voices in. I'm really fascinated that you also started to talk about science and technology leaders, people involved in climate change. The amazing group of students that I've been working at here at the University of St Andrews have really exploded what peace building looks like for me by putting together a virtual museum that has all sorts of items on climate change and on peace in space and artivism and all sorts of different things. So I suppose one final question that I have for you is, if peace building and peacekeeping end up being more explicitly tied to tackling climate change, is more explicitly tied to other kinds of futures thinking that deal with AI and beyond simply human futures, that's also connected to artivism, the arts and so on, do you think we should still call it peace building, peacekeeping? I'm thinking partly that in the UK we have ministers and budgets for the environment, ministers and budgets for education. Ultimately, some of that is all piecework, but we don't put it under that umbrella. Would you advocate for disaggregating it all still and us all thinking about it separately? Is there a future that you can imagine where we actually think of it all in a new way of understanding peacekeeping or peace building?
That's a really good question. I think, whenever I've had conversations with scholars about what it means to, so for example, talking with Victoria Basham about what does the symbol of the red poppy do? What kind of emotions does it evoke? What kinds of systems and institutions do we then kind of cling to saving when that symbol is under contestation or potential elimination from our society? Everyone gets really panicky. And when I was talking with her about that many years ago, I was struck by this idea that she shared with, all the people that contribute and do peace work, which is it, but we were talking about it as national service, national civil service, being a teacher, being a nurse. We don't often consider those to be civil servant positions the way we do when we talk about soldiers or, military personnel. And so your point about peace work and harnessing the kind of peace work that's done, I think it's a really important avenue to potentially pursue. And I know that, for example, I went to this conference on sexual and gender-based violence in conflict and post-conflict settings that was hosted in Norway many years ago. And the military, actually, the Defense College, hosted it. And it was fascinating because they were really interested in not bringing this kind of colonial mindset with them on their peacekeeping deployment. So one of the things that I suggested was, well, rather than see yourself as teaching or saving or rescuing or even converting people to your way of thinking, you could think of yourselves as gender experts, right? Because that's something that you have expertise in. So if you're bringing your gender expertise to another context, what would an inclusive version or an intersectional version or a participatory version of this gender expertise look like? And so I think that, and they saw themselves as peace experts, right? Like, because they're from a country that, has a whole host of scholars that write about peace, that they have scholars from PRIO talk about, certain kinds of ideas of gender equality have been branded, but so has feminist foreign policy, so has peace. I criticize this in the book, but it seems like it has its natural home in Nordic contexts. So we could also brand in ways, I don't want to advocate branding anything, but, I guess we could really invest in what kinds of things we're good at. If it's establishing gender equality policies, if it's doing everyday peace work in the classroom, in the hospital, if it's making people well, then it could be that we share this expert knowledge and that we celebrate it to some extent, not necessarily in those problematic patriotic terms that I think we tend to in the UK. But yeah, I think investing in developing expertise and developing deep global forms of knowledge and sharing that knowledge or building capacity in other places so that there can be egalitarian or inclusive dialogues. That to me is a good imaginary, or it's a good way of, I think, fostering different ways of thinking. And you said that I argue at the end in the conclusion of the book about thinking differently. And I think that the only way to think differently and to create that space of that different imaginary is to go back to all of the work, right? Like, so people like Margot Tudor, for example, who are looking at the histories of the UN and going back and looking at what has the UN done, how was it formed, what was its thinking at the outset, but also what did feminists write about peacekeeping in the 2000s, like I say in my book? What did post-colonial critics and scholars write about peacekeeping? What did the anti-militarists say about, what did they warn us about in peacekeeping? And so if we go back to those critical thinkers, as well as the mainstream work that talks about the need for peacekeeping because it saves lives, if we are able to think, perhaps not just think differently, but think in across many different literatures, then that space for thinking about peace differently will, I think, emerge through dialogue and through scholarship.
So that thinking differently can be within this very contemporary period of time by bringing in, for example, women involved for the last 30 years in the women's peace movement in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that kind of expertise. But also, as you say, and I'm a Roman historian by training, so I'm delighted to hear you say that history matters here and that actually digging deep into the history. And for me, one of the projects that I'm working on is actually looking at different peace imaginaries really in the distant past, what deep history, what some of the sort of peace imaginaries and the values that were attached to different kinds of peace and peacekeeping and peace building looked like as a mirror and a sort of window onto some of our peace imaginaries today. You mentioned the poppy as this sort of very affective symbol into which so much meaning is packed. And I like that idea that we might grope towards thinking not about brand peace, as it were, but about how we can generate more emotional, affective associations with peace that have traction and that have the same kind of collective power to sort of generate communal collective action, will, interest, commitment. And that is something I think that we don't have as much of. There are obviously peace symbols, but one feature of our still militarized societies is that military symbols still have much more affective power than peace symbols.
That's a really good point. And rather than venerate a nurse or a teacher in the same way that peacekeepers are, we might want to just, I think, have available to us a more nuanced and a more diverse set of role models, that we have in terms of who does peace work. And I think it's that instinctive veneration and honoring of peacekeeping and all that's attached to it that irks me and that makes me, want to critique it even more. But I definitely think that the book is a critique. And I think that the next work, not necessarily mine, but the future of peacekeeping work, has to be something that isn't just a critique, a continuation of this critique, because even I'm sick of this critique, right? Like, I think that the scholars and the researchers and the analysts speaking to people who live and work in peacekeeping missions and the people who work as peacekeepers, actually hearing their stories and being able to fit those stories into the epistemic project and change it is really, really important. So I like what you said about thinking differently, but thinking differently and doing new research that is either looking at those histories, those archives, I point to that at the end, and sort of imagining differently so that we can create new research, new research questions, new research findings, all of that by thinking differently from the outset and maintaining that throughout.
Yeah, so working towards a different future for peacekeeping, peace building through diverse voices and stories, different stories, individual personal stories and experiences, and stories that can displace the very institutionalized thinking that we're socialized into. I was in a classroom of 8-year-olds not very long ago and asked them who they thought peacekeepers were. And they hadn't been socialized into thinking about soldiers or James Bond type figures or whatever. They said Greta Thunberg and David Attenborough. And that was really fantastic to hear. And it does remind us that actually the knowledge that we have, the assumptions that we have are assumptions that actually we're socialized into maybe in our slightly later childhood, as we go through senior school rather than perhaps primary school.
That's a very hopeful image of a peacekeeper, I think, and it links to what I'd said about science and climate, right?
Yeah,
They're both been, I think, speaking out very much on both drivers of conflict and the aftermaths of conflict and how conflict and the earth are interconnected and the impacts of those on different species. Yeah, so that's hopeful.
Very hopeful. Yeah. And it's good to end on a note of hope and thinking about imagining different peace imaginaries, imagining peace and peacekeeping differently in the future. Marsha, you've given us so much to think about. I hugely enjoyed your book. It asks us to wrestle with the idea of abolishing something that seems to be so important and so embedded. But the minute we start thinking about what its problems are, what the systemic problems are at the heart of current approaches to peace building and what the alternatives might be, then we can really see the value of these different peace imaginaries and thinking about peace differently and knowing peace differently. So thank you so much for talking to me today and exploring that with us.
Thank you very much for having me. And, each time I talk about my book, it's like different things come out, and it just makes me happy that I managed to get as much in there. But then it inspires me to write more and to read more. As you say, I think the call, maybe something that I could have added to the book that I didn't, but that I would add to the podcast, is just about, reading across interdisciplinary lines really helps us to think differently. And I think most scholars are doing that, but just to really encourage us to push ourselves, because maybe we'd come up with figures like the 8-year-olds did as role models of peace if we read, more widely and paid attention to people in the humanities and in the sciences, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and across all of those social sciences, humanities, the sciences as well. Absolutely, I fully agree. Thank you again, Marsha, for a fascinating conversation. Thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We do have more episodes coming up over the winter as we continue to explore different visualizations of both war and peace in different contexts. So please keep tuning in. If you'd like to support our project, you can share it with others in your network. And if you'd like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War or Visualising Peace, or get in touch with us directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you very much for listening.